All right, everyone. Today I have traded up Skip for a much prettier model. This is my wife, Andrea Walter. She works in mental health as a pharmacist. And so, we would like to continue our conversation on mental health from last week into this week with someone who actually knows what they're talking about and does this for a living. So, Andrea, can you give us a little background on yourself? What brought you into your field, and how did you become a mental health pharmacist, or however that works?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so my journey to becoming a mental health provider was not a very direct route. And I think a lot of people, when you think pharmacy, you're not really thinking about mental health. So I went to pharmacy school with an interest in doing things like diabetes education, tobacco cessation. My first job out of residency, I got put in a mental health clinic, and that's not what I had planned for. It was a surprise to me. But once I got there, I found out that I really liked it. I felt like it gave me the opportunity to talk to patients about what was really important in their life and then help them understand how medications can help them get there.
Yeah. So one of the things we've been talking about, I know, like at the dinner table and afterwards, we talk about suicide awareness and like how important that has been lately in your job, especially like since COVID, like when suicides really become high risk back then. So can you tell us a little bit more about like, you know, the stigma behind suicide awareness, people not being willing to talk about it, and how many people are affected by this every day? And when somebody does commit suicide, what does that mean for the world around them, and how can we prevent this?
Yeah, so I do think it is really important to normalize the conversation. It can be a really uncomfortable and scary topic for a lot of people. But one thing that has happened within the past year is our kids have actually dealt with suicide in their school.
Yep.
They know people who have died by suicide. So this isn't just a conversation that should be happening in a mental health clinic. This is a conversation that we're having with our family. And so, with our friends if needed. So there's a statistic that I've used that one suicide is estimated to impact 135 people, and I've been one of those people. And so that's created a passion for me to promote awareness of suicide screening and education, and just kind of getting people comfortable talking about it, because it's only when we really have the conversation that people can move forward.
Yeah, and there's especially with like older men, it's like the stigma of like I'm okay, I'm
Hmm.
okay until I'm not. And
Hmm.
then it's a sudden, like, I didn't know that they were struggling. I didn't know that there was a
Yeah.
problem. And a lot of it's just because, we were taught to like just hold it in, like toughen
Hmm.
up. Just
Yeah.
deal with it. It's not hard. Just deal with it. And that's an incorrect way of thinking, as I've discovered in my career and personal life. Is like you gotta figure it out. Like running a business,
Yeah.
I have a lot of anxiety. And so making that step of saying, I need citrulline or whatever, just like to get through this so I can think clearly on the things that matter. That's important to
Hmm.
acknowledge. Otherwise, you're just going to start shutting down as you're overwhelmed. You're going to make bad decisions. You're going to make decisions that you wouldn't normally make in the moment because your brain isn't functioning the way it should. And so,
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. And, when you talk about demographics of suicide, one of the higher risk groups is males that are over the age of 45. And it can be because we've created an environment where there's a stigma talking about mental health, or people are afraid to talk about suicide, or they don't want to stress someone else out. Sometimes people might be afraid to bring it up with a healthcare provider. They're afraid that they're going to get forced into hospitalization. But there's one thing I've learned, and there's just this huge continuum of, people having these passive thoughts. It can start with thoughts like, I wish I was dead. I wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. Um, to maybe thinking about suicide, sometimes you just go into problem solving mode, right? I mean, that's what a lot of people do. Like, you're in pain, you're struggling, you're not quite sure to how to handle it, and you think maybe this seems like a good solution because suicide is an end. The hard part is that sometimes for a lot of people, it can be a very last minute decision. It can be a very impromptu thing. And so, one of the things I talk about is lethal means safety, is just putting as much distance as you can between yourself and any type of lethal means. So, firearm is a really common mode of suicide. And so, just making sure that you're storing your firearms in a way that's safe. And that's good, just good practice in general. Use a safe, use a gun lock, store your ammunition separately. So when you're not thinking clearly, when people really are struggling with depression and anxiety, you might make a choice that's different than what you would make if you were really thinking it through. So putting some time and distance in between you and anything that can be used.
I
And
think
just
you I think you
yeah,
used
go
to
ahead.
tell a story about I think it's the Golden Gate Bridge and people jumping off of it and the people who
Yeah.
survived. So
So one of the things that's been really impactful in my career is a bunch of years ago I was at a psychiatric pharmacy conference, and the speaker was a guy named Kevin Hines, and he survived a suicide attempt jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And he had bipolar disorder, or has bipolar disorder, and he was having a lot of thoughts going through his head, just kind of had this very strong feeling that he needed to die. And he went to the Golden Gate Bridge, and he honestly was hoping that somebody would recognize that he wasn't okay. But he got up on the ledge, he jumped off, and he tells a story now that the first thing that went through his mind after he jumped is, I don't really want to die. And he survived. The Coast Guard, by some miracle, was in the area. They were able to rescue him. He went through rehabilitation at the hospital. And now he speaks out on suicide prevention and suicide awareness. So I do think that his story highlights the importance of, if you're around somebody and you're maybe seeing some signs or you're recognizing some things that don't seem quite right, it really is important to ask, check in. Hey, are you doing okay? What's going on?
what are some of those symptoms that are like easier to tell? Like I know a lot of it involves you having a good personal relationship, and I know at Humanize
Yeah.
IT we talk about having a relationship with your clients and with your other employees all the time. It's really important. But are there ways to like to say, oh, Bob over there is not doing well. How do I what are some indicators of a normal functioning human struggling with this depression or anxiety or suicide awareness or sorry, suicidal thoughts? How do you key in on that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about recognizing what some of the risk factors might be. So there's risk factors and there's protective factors. But if you know anything about what's going on in their life, any kind of stressful life circumstance could be a risk factor. If somebody is going through a divorce, if they're suffering from grief, maybe a spouse or a close family member has died, if they are going through a job loss, those kinds of stressful situations can maybe make those thoughts more prominent. Substance use, sometimes when we talk about looking for a solution to the pain, if you're going through a lot of pain, if they're increasing substance use, increasing alcohol use, that can be one of the risk factors. And just feeling wise, and you may not always know this unless you ask, but if you notice that someone is more withdrawn in activities that they would normally enjoy, or if they're just feeling really hopeless, or if they are making comments like, yeah, I mean, people would be better off without me, or maybe it'd be better if I wasn't here. Those would maybe be statements that would maybe prompt you to ask more questions to really check in and see how they're doing.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine talk to me the other day, and I was like, they were mentioning, felt like they were fighting the fight alone. No one was
Hmm.
there to help them, and there were all these key phrases like "they're alone, they're alone, they're alone."
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
I said, "Hey, I need you to check. Just do a
Yeah.
mental check." This
Hmm.
is a very self-aware person, and just do a mental check. And they're like, "You're right, thank you." And sometimes like it's like guys, I'm gonna relate it back to the server hardware you're on. You've got an unhealthy monitoring server. Let's say it's Logarithm or some kind of logging server you have, and it's not behaving correctly. The the answer isn't to push it harder. Everybody knows is the answer is to look and see what's the problem, address the problem, figure out is there a way to fix this so that you can move on? Because your logging server is what tells you what's going on in your environment. It
Mhm.
tells you everything that's going to happen. But if it's not behaving correctly, you're not going to know when something else is failing in in your environment. So your brain this is your center. If there's something
Mhm.
wrong with it, it
Yeah.
sometimes takes an outside influence to come in and say, "Hey, you've been off lately. Are you okay?" And that simple check from an outside source is just like somebody checking the server, like looking at the logs. That server is really chunky lately. It's really slow. It's not behaving like it normally does. And I can now go in and look. And sometimes it just takes that person from the outside saying, you seem to be really testy lately. Or I noticed you're on your sixth Red Bull this morning. you know?
Yeah, and it's always okay to ask.
Yeah.
It's always okay to ask, "Hey, I noticed you're not yourself lately. What's going on? Can we talk about it?" Um, and it's even okay to ask about suicide. And I really do try to normalize the conversation. And there's a training that's done. I'm not trained to do this. It's called QPR, question. Um, oh, I forget what the P is, and then refer. But really asking the question, you know, sometimes when people are struggling, they start to have thoughts where, they wish they were dead. Is that happening with you? You're not going to give anybody any ideas.
Yeah.
Asking is not going to make them more likely to engage in suicidal behavior. But it really can open up the door for them to talk about something that they may not know how to bring up otherwise.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's always okay. And I think even, in your podcast last week, I know you talked about, your journey. And even in my life, I've gone through some stressful situations at work. I mean, there have been times where at work and at home, I just have felt overwhelmed or felt like I'm drowning. And some of those symptoms that I noticed, um, I would wake up in the middle of the night and not be able to fall back to sleep. Um, you know, and there were times when I could recognize something wasn't quite right because like I would have this pain. It just felt like my whole skeleton hurt. It just felt like all of my bones hurt. And I knew enough about meds. I actually talked to my primary care provider, and I have taken meds for mental health. And I've also I've used an employee assistance program to do some therapy, and both of those things are really helpful. And I know sometimes, you're thinking about your problems. You think like, how is a med going to make this situation any better? Um, and a med doesn't make a stressful situation go away, but it can help you handle it better, and it
Yeah.
can help reframe the way that you're thinking about it.
Yeah. Instead of needing that Red Bull, which has a ton of negative side effects to it. So you can exacerbate a problem. Like, so your problem is you're sleepy all the time. Maybe you
Hmm.
were on call, like as an engineer, you were on call last night. You have to come in this morning and you have to deal with the fallout of the issues from last night. And you have to do this big project coming up. Otherwise, you don't get paid. And so you drink Red Bull or your stimulant of choice. And then the bad part of that hits you. Even if you're doing the
Yeah.
sugar-free one, the bad part stuff hits you. Your body is not meant to run at that speed. And so the side effects of a Red Bull are significantly higher than, say, some of the controlled substances you can get from a mental health provider. And you can get the same benefit. And it can make it short term so that you can make better decisions. So like I talk about when doing anxiety, like it feels like my whole body's on electricity and
Hmm.
I'm really heightened, and I can make impulsively bad decisions. Like, oh, if I could just think clearly, I'll be fine. So you can go on a temporary med while you're going through a budget crunch, while you're going through a
Hmm.
stressful time as a company. I know a bunch of you MSPs had a hard time when there was some of those the hacks that were coming out there through your PSA, and it's a temporary thing. It's situational, but you need to think clearly. Talk to your mental health provider or talk to your primary care provider and say, "Hey, look, I'm going through a hard time right now. Is there anything that can help me with these physical symptoms of anxiety?" And
Yeah, and I
they can do that. It's not a forever thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I would encourage people to go into it with an open mind because while my symptoms that I experienced were trouble with sleep and difficulty with pain, what helped me was not necessarily a sleep medication or a pain medication. I went with something first line. It was an antidepressant, and that actually helped both
Yep.
things. It was the stress, it was the anxiety that was causing, and yeah. So I talked to a lot of people about that as a first line option, and I would encourage people to go into it with an open mind because there's a lot of studies just with antidepressants. They're first line for anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and really do have a lot of benefit in terms of pain management, if it's related to stress and sleep as well. And going back to the caffeine, one thing that I educate a lot of people on is caffeine has a 12-hour half-life, which means that 12 hours after you drink any or have caffeine, half of it's still in your body. So I mean, if you're drinking something at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to get through a slump, then that means half of it's still there at 3 a.m. And some people might not have trouble falling asleep. I hear that a lot. I can still fall asleep all the time, but it's going to decrease that quality of sleep and it's going to make your sleep less
Yep.
restful. And it's really going to interfere with you getting good quality sleep, which again is going to make you tired. And it creates a cycle
And
that
you
can
drink
be
more.
risky. Yeah, and I say that as somebody, I love coffee. I love the way caffeine makes me feel like I can accomplish anything. And I have, coffee every morning and sometimes in the afternoon, but I do really think a lot about, how much and what kind of impact it's going to have on me later in the
Yeah.
day.
I used to be an
Yeah.
all day coffee drinker, guys. Like pot of
Mhm.
coffee, I could polish that off without even a second thought. And then years ago, I stopped having coffee in the afternoon. Um, and it does help. It helps significantly. I used
Mhm.
to stay up till midnight every night. And then that was just my routine. And I found I was getting more and more sleep deprived. And some of that was because of my job, some of it was because of being on call. And the idea is that um you want to create an atmosphere where your body can work great. You're so good at troubleshooting these servers, these firewalls and everything, and keeping them healthy and running well. Then you look at yourself, like, are you treating yourself with the same care that you're treating these impersonal devices? How can you function well if you're spending your time doing these bad habits that are compounding? It's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. It's like when you've got a server and you've got a hard drive. Back in the day, we had head failures, right? They would touch the plate, and you could live with one because you had 16 drives sitting there. But if you didn't take care of that, eventually it was going to get worse and worse and worse. And so with your own body, you have to think of it the same way. Like, how do I make this better? How do I do a self check? Or with my employees, we talked about last session. If you see an employee who's a 5-star employee and they're now like a 2-star, you might want to just dive in there. And then maybe they're resistant. And you might have to let that employee go for performance reasons, but that might be what helps them get on the right track. That might be what eventually helps them ultimately, because
Mhm.
we're here, we're all human beings and we're trying to get through this life. And if you're treating everybody like this machine and you're not giving them the same level of care as a machine and you're just expecting output from them all the time, no, you got to care for it. Otherwise, it's going to burn out. It's going to go away. It's going to stop functioning well.
Yeah, one of the amazing things about biology is just our bodies are incredibly complex, and it's just really beautiful how it all works together. For you to be able to think or to do the things that you enjoy. And, as a pharmacist, I think a lot of people go to medicine, that I know a lot about medicine, but I really tell people I know a lot about the pros and cons of anything that you put into your body. And so, what I want people to do is make an informed decision. I want you to be informed about what you're putting into your body. It might be medications, it might be the way that you eat, alcohol, marijuana. All of these things are going to interact, with the chemical makeup of your body and are going to have different benefits and potential risks. And so, what I really want people to do is just kind of think through what's the benefit risk ratio of whatever they put into their body.
Yeah, I really want to make sure that people are just doing that self-check. Are you eating healthily? Are you drinking
Mhm,
a lot? That's an indicator
mhm.
for me. Like I get at night and I get stressed and I have a couple whiskeys and I'm like, oh, crap, I shouldn't have a couple. I should have a glass of water and I should go to bed on time. Because if you have the whiskey, if you have the alcohol, you're not going to sleep well. And the next day you're going to be more stressed. What are you going to do the next night? You're going to snack and you're going to drink again. You're going to self-medicate. And
Yeah.
people often think self-medication is, oh, I'm using some kind of illegal drug. No, it's you're self-medicating with caffeine. You're self-medicating with alcohol. You're self-medicating with carbohydrates that make you feel good.
Yeah,
Um,
I was actually listening to a call about alcohol not that long ago. And one of the things that I learned, I don't know why I hadn't really thought about this before, but people like alcohol because it numbs a lot of uncomfortable feelings. Okay, you're feeling anxious, like you're having social anxiety, you're worried. You have alcohol and it calms that down, which could be a benefit, but it's also going to calm down or kind of depress a lot of good feelings in your life. So it kind of keeps you more in the middle. And so it's technically a depressant. So I mean, if you're always consistently trying to quelch those bad feelings, just know that it's also quelching a lot of the good feelings
yeah,
as well, and you're going to be less able to kind of feel joy from the good parts of your life,
yeah.
by that.
And again, that's that bad cycle Andrew was talking about earlier.
Mhm.
You drink at night, then you have caffeine during the day, and then you drink at night, you have caffeine during
Yeah.
the day. And at some point, you have to stop the cycle. I know that when I drink more water, I feel better. I feel
Yeah.
amazing. Sometimes I'm drinking alcohol because my body thinks that's the only place it can get fluid. I've trained my body to behave in a way that is counterproductive. And you got to do that check on yourself. Yes,
Yep.
you like whiskey. That's fine. Just don't drink 6 glasses a night. You know,
Mhm.
you like coffee. That's great. Just don't drink 2 pots a day.
Yeah.
And so get higher quality coffee, reward yourself for drinking less, get yourself like we have a grind and brew upstairs, this Pico Bistro, and it's great. And you just gotta be more aware of what you're putting in your body and what you're asking it to do, just like you would any other device in your environment. But treat yourself like a human being and treat others the same way. Look for indicators that they're not performing well. And this next episode, what we're going to talk about is coping skills. There are simple techniques you can use that a lot of people aren't aware of to help you get over that hump or to get you to a good place. I've seen in Reddit lately a lot of people talking about hopelessness, about how they're just burnt out, they're the final straw, and stuff like that in the MSP world where they're just looking to leave because they can't take it anymore. They like the work, they don't like the environment, or they can't get ahead, a
Mhm.
number of things. But how do you cope? If you had a coping skill, would it make things better for you? So thanks, Andrea, for coming on today. We'll see everybody next week for coping skills.